All right, let's dive right into this explainer. Today, we're unpacking a massive 75-year saga that literally altered the course of South Asian history. We're talking about the Lodhi Dynasty. From 1451 to 1526, they ruled as the fifth and, spoiler alert, final line of the Delhi Sultanate. But what makes them so incredibly fascinating is that they were the first and only Afghan, specifically Pashtun dynasty, to sit on the throne of Delhi. We're going to trace this epic tale today, and it's got a bit of everything. An empire rising from a total political vacuum, some absolutely brilliant cultural innovations, and finally a tragic internal betrayal that practically handed the subcontinent straight to the Mughal Empire. Here is the playbill for our three-act tragedy today. We'll start with Section 1, the Afghan ascendancy, then 2, the zenith under Sikandar Lodhi, 3, Ibrahim's fatal autocracy, 4, the fall at Panipat, and finally 5, the enduring Lodhi legacy. Let's get to it. Section 1, the Afghan ascendancy, building a tribal confederacy. To really understand how this dynasty got its start, you have to picture the absolute chaos of the mid-15th century. The declining Sayyid dynasty had basically left this massive political vacuum. Enter Bahlul Lodhi. He was a powerful Afghan governor of Sirhind, and he just started methodically absorbing neighboring territories. Finally, in 1451, the reigning Sayyid ruler pretty much just threw his hands up and abdicated. That allowed Bahlul to walk right into Delhi and seize the throne. So this whole 75-year era breaks down perfectly into 3 distinct leadership phases. We kick things off with the founder, Bahlul Lodhi, in 1451. Fast forward to 1489, his son Sikandar takes over and brings the empire to its absolute peak. But then, in 1517, Ibrahim Lodhi steps in, bringing this heavy-handed autocracy that leads straight to the dynasty's violent end in 1526 at the Battle of Panipat. Keep these 3 very different leaders in the back of your mind as we go. Now, if you want to understand why Bahlul was so successful at first, you've got to look at how he handled the Amara, his Afghan nobles and clan chieftains. Instead of playing the role of a distant, untouchable despot, Bahlul leaned hard into Afghan tribal customs. He treated his nobles like equals, like brothers in a shared enterprise. I mean, he'd literally stand up from his throne to greet them. This consultative, first-among-equals vibe built incredible loyalty. It created a highly motivated fighting force that helped him conquer major rivals like the Sharqi Sultanate of Jaunpur. But, and this is a big but, building a whole empire on a loose tribal confederacy? Yeah, that was a structural ticking time bomb for whoever had to follow him. Section 2, the zenith, Sikandar Lodhi. After Bahlul passes away in 1489, his son takes the reins as Sikandar Lodhi. And he actually manages this brilliant, super delicate balancing act, mixing his dad's collaborative tribal model with his own vision for a much more unified, centralized state. One of his masterstrokes? The strategic founding of Agra in 1504. Now, he didn't just build it because he wanted a pretty new city. This was a highly calculated military and administrative play. Delhi was just way too far north to properly project power down into the eastern and southern theaters, places like Gwalior and Rajasthan. By shifting the capital down to Agra, Sikandar essentially locked down control of his expanding frontiers. And it's pretty wild to think that this very city, founded by an Afghan sultan, would go on to become a massive cornerstone of Indian history, and eventually the home of the Taj Mahal. But he wasn't just a military strategist. The guy was a remarkably capable administrator. He introduced something called the Guz-e-Sikandari. Basically, it was a standardized measuring yard for land. Now, that might sound like a minor detail, but standardizing measurements across a massive empire, that was a total game changer for the time. It completely undercut corrupt local officials who were just making up arbitrary tax assessments. It made state revenue predictable, and crucially, it made life significantly better for the peasant cultivators. Throw in his strict crackdown on highway robbery, and Sikandar's administrative reforms actually sparked this massive empire-wide revival of trade and commerce. Now, his legacy does get pretty complex, especially when we look at his religious and cultural policies, which historians are literally still debating today. We see a real duality here. On one hand, Persian chronicles, like the Tariq-i-Dawdi, paint him as a strict enforcer of Islamic orthodoxy, noting times when he pushed restrictive public policies and even destroyed temples in places like Mathura. But then, on the flip side, you have this ruler who is deeply, genuinely curious and totally willing to cross sectarian lines. He actively patronized Sanskrit scholars. He even commissioned the translation of a major Ayurvedic medical text into Persian, a work known as the Tib-i-Sikandari. It's just a fascinating contradiction, right? A a ruler tightening orthodox observance in public, while privately indulging in this broad, cross-cultural intellectual curiosity. Section 3. Ibrahim's fatal autocracy. So it's 1517, Sikandar dies and his son Ibrahim Lodhi steps up to the throne. Now Ibrahim inherits this wealthy, stable, massive empire, but he fundamentally misunderstands the political culture of his own people, and because of that he plunges the entire sultanate into a disastrous, heavy-handed era of absolute autocracy. Just look at the contrast. Where his grandfather Bahlul ruled as that first among equals, relying on tribal consensus, Ibrahim basically took all those traditional courtesies and threw them out the window. He demanded absolute submission. He tried to force a centralized despotic monarchy onto a deeply tribal system, and in doing so, he completely alienated his most vital military supporters. He was notoriously suspicious, quick to take offense, and just constantly humoring his top nobles. And you better believe the consequences were immediate and catastrophic. Ibrahim starts heavily purging his court. We're talking imprisoning and executing prominent Afghan nobles, even the senior commanders who had loyally served his own father. This reign of terror just fractures the empire right down the middle. Over in the east, the powerful governor of Bihar, Darya Khan Lahani, decides he's had enough and breaks away completely, setting up his own independent Afghan state. So the empire is literally tearing itself apart from the inside, bleeding resources and unified strength at the exact moment it's going to need it most. Because that alienation finally hits a breaking point. Up in the Punjab, you have the powerful governor, Dalit Khan Lodhi, and get this, Ibrahim's own uncle, Alam Khan. They make a desperate, fateful decision. They reach out to Kabul, and they take the fateful step of inviting a Timurid prince named Zahir ad-Din Muhammad Babur to invade India and depose Ibrahim. Just let the grim irony of that sink in for a second. To settle a domestic family dispute, the alienated Afghan nobility literally invited a foreign conqueror right to their own doorstep. Which brings us to Section 4, the fall at Panipat. The date is April 21st, 1526. We're just north of Delhi, on the plains of Panipat. All that internal political fragmentation of the Lodhi state we just talked about, it is about to collide head-on with a massive external threat. And on that battlefield, the military asymmetry was just staggering. Ibrahim shows up with this massive traditional force. Chronicles estimate he had up to 100,000 men and this terrifying corps of war elephants. Babur, on the other hand, only brought somewhere between 12,000 and 25,000 men. But what Babur lacked in numbers, he made up for with modern combined arms warfare. While Ibrahim was still relying on traditional, frontal cavalry charges, Babur brought Ottoman-trained gunners packing matchlocks and cannons. He even chained carts together to build this mobile field fortification, which basically created a protective wall of cover for his artillery. The actual battle, it was chaotic, and it was brief. The second the Lodhi forces charged, Babur's artillery just opened up. The deafening noise and the literal impact of the cannons completely panicked Ibrahim's war elephants. They ended up stampeding backward and trampling their own men. Then Babur drops the hammer. He executes the Tulugma, which is this classic Central Asian flanking and encirclement maneuver. His cavalry sweeps around the edges and entirely surrounds the massive, now totally disorganized Lodhi army. Just like that, Ibrahim's outdated military doctrine was completely neutralized. 1526, definitely a year to remember, because it is literally the year the world changed. Up to 20,000 Lodhi soldiers were killed that day, and Ibrahim himself actually died fighting on the battlefield. That's a pretty rare end for a sultan, but undeniably a definitive one. This singular date didn't just mark the end of one battle, or even just the end of a 75-year dynasty. It basically snapped the hinge of world history, instantly terminating the entire 300-year-old Delhi Sultanate. So, let's look at Section 5, the enduring Lodhi legacy. Because even though their rule was relatively short, the consequences of their collapse laid the groundwork for the reality of the subcontinent for the next several centuries. When we synthesize exactly why they fell, it becomes super clear that it wasn't just about losing one battle at Panipat. It was a whole chain reaction. The tribal confederacy was just structurally too weak to handle that sudden shift to centralized autocracy. Ibrahim's total failure of statecraft, those brutal noble purges, it all caused regional fragmentation, especially losing a key area like Bihar. All of that left them politically isolated. So by the time they walked onto the battlefield at Panipat and faced Babur's massive technological advantage, they were already divided and, quite frankly, doomed. But we can't just leave their legacy a political failure. Take a look at their incredible cultural footprint. which you can still walk through today in New Delhi's Lodhi Gardens. Their architecture was this absolutely crucial bridge between the older Sultanate styles and the masterpieces that were yet to come. They pioneered the early use of double-dome construction and the charbagh, that really iconic formal garden tomb layout, and those exact architectural vocabularies, they were fully absorbed and elevated by the Mughals, feeding directly into the design of world wonders like the Taj Mahal. Plus, Sikandar's administrative systems, like that land measurement we talked about, laid the direct groundwork for later Mughal taxation systems. So think back to Dalit Khan and Alam Khan. They invited Babur in to solve their Ibrahim problem, probably assuming he'd just loot the place and head back to Kabul. Did the Afghan nobility simply trade an unpopular king for a far more formidable master? It turns out they accidentally birthed the mighty Mughal Empire right out of a domestic family feud. They swapped out a flawed, short-term king for a master who would rule for the next 300 years. Definitely something to chew on the next time you hear about a seemingly small internal political dispute. Thanks for joining me on this explainer, and as always, keep questioning history.